How does a country hunt down a serial killer and end up convicting the wrong man for his crimes? In 1957, a young woman was found brutally murdered near the Martfű shoe factory in Hungary. The police caught their man within days. He confessed, he was sentenced to death, and the town finally slept soundly. There was just one problem. While that man sat in a prison cell for the next 11 years, the real killer was still working at that same factory, driving the same truck and waiting for the sun to go down. Today, we are looking into the Martfű monster, a case where the only thing more terrifying than the killer was the system that protected him. Some content may be graphic in nature and listener discretion is advised. Each episode is created with deep respect for the victims, their families, and their loved ones. Welcome back to our channel. This is Start with the Weird with Reka and Roderick. Stacy was busy today, so she didn't join us. And today we are going to discuss the case of Péter Kovács, the Martfű monster, who is another Hungarian serial killer. And this case is extremely fascinating and really drags you in because there's so many things that gone wrong with the whole investigation that actually laughable how the system worked back then in Hungary in the 60s.
Hi guys, it's Roderick here. Like as usual, I came absolutely unprepared, so I'm a very bad student. But just judging from the hook, it should be a very interesting case with lots of pivots, as I assume. And I'm really looking forward to examining it today.
And it's also a very long case, so everyone buckle up. Now, I would just like to add that, again, it's a case that happened more than 50 years ago, and it wasn't easy to get the details together, but it is a little bit closer to our time than the previous episodes were. So we've got a little bit more to add to the story. But unfortunately, the details of the background of this person, Kovács Péter, I could not find anything besides where he was born and where he lived, and a little bit about his family life, but not in detail, so I apologize about that. If anyone knows anything further, obviously let us know in the comments.
As I understand, again, we'll have a lot of those could-be moments.
Yes and no. So not as many could-be moments than we had before. The timeline is pretty straight and straightforward, following the first murder committed, but we don't know much about before that.
Okay, let's find out.
Yeah, let's jump right into it. Just a little bit about the background. Kovács Péter, he was born in Szeged in 1934, and we have, as I said, we have very little record of his early years. His childhood and youth remain largely undocumented. What was known was that he eventually settled into a steady job and what appeared to be a stable family life, at least on the surface. And he was working as a truck driver in the Martfű area. So this is pretty much the same area as we covered with the Angel Makers and later on with Pipás Pista. So this whole Alföld area is basically, you were asking about it in the last episode, and I tried to explain that it's basically a farmland. It's also called the Great Plain of Hungary. So it's the same area. And this thought popped into my mind that in America, like Central America, as in the country, where all these farmlands are, and most of the serial killers were pretty much born in there and acted in there because it's just, I guess, it's a good place to hide the body. And I don't know, probably nobody notices if someone goes missing, although this is just an assumption. But it's interesting to compare Hungary to America, that we have this huge land that it's not really populated, and that's where most of these murders were committed.
I was thinking, what do they put in that water in the area? Because it seems like a very fruitful land for this specific kind of individuals.
Yeah, so Hungary is a very small country and we don't have many serial killers like America does or bigger countries do. Yet the ones we do have, they did come out of this area, which is quite interesting to think about. Yeah, maybe there is something in the water. Who knows? Anyway, so he was working there as a truck driver, and this is a key because it meant he was constantly out on those roads, visiting all the surrounding settlements and those really isolated, uninhabited outlying areas. He wasn't just passing through, he developed a massive amount of local knowledge. He knew the terrain inside out, which, as we'll see, becomes a pretty chilling advantage. Now, just to talk about him a little bit, unlike your typical lust killer who might have a history of being a bit of a loner or a drifter, Kovács actually had a very average, well-ordered background. He lived in a house he'd built himself with his family, and he wasn't known as a work evader. He was a guy who showed up and did his job. On the surface, there were no red flags. He was just another face in the community, leading what looked like a perfectly stable, productive life. So far we have a man at this point, he doesn't have a family, but he does have a really good job. He's hardworking and basically just an okay guy. We don't know if he's a nice guy like, Kish Bela was, but he's pretty much there in the community.
I mean, not every serial killer was a guy who basically stood out, A lot of them actually look like pretty average people, Usually even their colleagues describe them like, oh, he was such a nice guy. He always helped me carry the bags and he always said hi to everyone. So, I mean, in a way, I'm not surprised that he was just like a regular dude.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there are more than one personalities, but I think it kind of comes down to, because serial killers are psychopaths or sociopaths in some cases, but I think it comes down to that sometimes they want to sort of melt into society so they don't look suspicious, and I think this is what happened in his case.
I mean, the question is not if they want to basically blend in with the crowd, but rather if they can, For a lot of serial killers who are kind of like an odd duck, it's actually a bit of a sore that they cannot relate, that they cannot fit in. So I think it just maybe he was more emotionally flexible, or he could play the part, so he was basically capable of imitating a regular person, if it makes any sense.
I think it's rather he was capable of imitating emotions, because I do believe that psychopaths don't really have emotions, not as we do.
I mean, in that case, they wouldn't be able to commit all of those crimes. It makes sense. Yeah. So I guess at least he could mimic them.
Yeah. And this is a turning point. The real shift happened on the night of the 22nd of July, 1957. So just for you to be able to follow the whole timeline, the whole thing starts in 1957. Kovács was at the cinema in Martfű watching an Argentine film titled, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, Abuso de Confianza, or the English title is Breach of Trust. And there was a particular scene involving a man being violent toward a woman that completely triggered something in him. He found the whole thing incredibly arousing, and he walked out that theater with a desperate newfound urge to replicate that exact kind of violence in the real world. And I've done some research on this film. It's basically a drama about a student who lies about her identity to get help from a lawyer. And the movie is based on a French play by Pierre Wolf. I don't really know who he was, but apparently it was a very popular story at the time. But Kovács is likely the only person in history who saw this lawyer drama and decided it was a reason to start a killing spree. And it's a perfect example of the wrong person seeing the wrong thing at the wrong time.
But, I think it could have been anything else, because I guess like with art or generally in life, we only see what we're capable of seeing, what is already in us. It could have been a different movie just, with the same kind of notion, or he could just see a guy being violent to a woman on the street and it would have triggered the same thing. So I don't think the movie has anything to do with it in particular. Like you said, it's just kind of like a coincidence.
He certainly didn't waste any time acting on those impulses. Literally immediately after leaving the cinema, he made his way toward the Martfű shoe factory complex, timing it just as the women were finishing their afternoon shift. It was there that he caught sight of a young girl. She was walking home alone, following a farm road that led out toward Tisaföldvár. Despite not knowing this woman at all, Kovács began following her on his bicycle down that unlit road. In the pitch black of the countryside, he ambushed her, delivering a massive blow to the skull with a piece of iron he'd been carrying. She didn't stand a chance. He proceeded to rape and strangle her, and then, exactly as he'd seen in the film, he hid her body in a drainage ditch. But here's the truly horrific part. Her cause of death wasn't actually the head trauma or the strangulation. It was later determined she had actually drowned in that ditch. After he was done, Kovács simply headed home.
Oh my God, it's horrible.
Yeah, poor
Was
girl.
she unconscious when he was assaulting her?
Probably.
It's horrible.
So she didn't die with all of what he done to her. Probably was unconscious, and then she died in the water.
Damn. Like he really, really was a man of action. He saw, he liked, and then he went.
Yeah, he didn't waste any time, did he?
Oh my God. And as I understand, it's getting worse from here.
Sort of. I mean, it's pretty bad. But what does make it worse is what's coming now. So the victim's body was discovered the very next day by workers out near the border, and apparently Péter Kovács also appeared in the crowd of onlookers who gathered at the scene of the murder. So he sort of revisited the crime. Look what I've done.
I think they get like another wave of pleasure from seeing, like I said, what they've done.
Definitely. Well, he's a lust killer, so to speak. So yeah, there's just gives him the extra layer of lust, so to speak, which is horrible. Now, the police moved quickly on this, immediately digging into her personal life to see who she'd been associating with. They soon picked up on a connection at her workplace. The girl, Margit Szegedi, had been seeing a co-worker named János Kériák. It was a friendly relationship, nothing deep or serious yet, but in the eyes of the investigators, it was enough to put him right in their crosshairs. So here I went a little bit sideways because it's very important to talk about János Kériák, who was the boyfriend or romantic relation to this girl. So by August 31st, 1957, the prosecutor's office was already splashing their version of events across the newspapers, and they had painted a very specific and very damning picture of János Kériák. And so I added some notes here that like, how do you catch a monster when he looks exactly like a model citizen? And in the socialist era of the 1960s, serial killers weren't supposed to exist. They were considered a Western disease. So when women started disappearing near a quiet shoe factory town, the authorities did the unthinkable. They picked a name, forced a confession, and closed the books. But while the government congratulated itself, the real Monster of Martfű was busy raising a family, going to work, and planning his next stride. According to their narrative, Kériák was a man obsessed. They claimed he was deeply in love with his beautiful colleague Margit Szegedi, but that she didn't return his feelings because she was already planning to marry someone else. The prosecution's theory was that Kériák decided if he couldn't have her, no one would. They alleged that on the night of July 22nd, he waited for her outside the factory and offered to walk her home down that secluded road. The story they fed the press was incredibly graphic. They claimed that when Margit rejected his marriage proposal, Kériák pulled out a pre-prepared axe and struck her in the head. They described a vile and sadistic sequence where he dragged her into a cornfield to violate her before finally pushing her into the ditch and holding her under the water until she drowned. They even added the chilling detail that he simply got on his bike, went home, and turned up for work the next day as if he'd just done his job well. The whole proceeding was a mess because Kériák actually confessed, though we use that word loosely here. Back then, some of these voluntary confessions were beaten out of people during brutal interrogations until they said exactly what the police wanted to hear. It's worth emphasizing that this was a political embarrassment for the socialist government. At the time, the state's narrative was that serial killers only exist in the decadent West. Acknowledging that a sexual predator could operate for a decade in Hungary went against the regime's image of a perfect society. This is likely why they were so quick to pin it on Kyriak, to close the case and pretend the problem was solved. Even though Kyriak eventually withdrew that confession, it didn't matter. The court sentenced him to death right out of the gate. The Supreme Court did step in, feeling the circumstances of the murder were way too blurry, and sent it back for retrial. But even then, the court in Szolnok handed him another rope sentence. It was only when it went back to the Supreme Court that they commuted it to life imprisonment. While the real killer was still out there, János Kyriak was sent to the Star prison or Csillag prison in Szeged. He ended up serving 11 years for a crime he didn't commit. 11 years of his life had gone before his innocence was finally proven. And all the while he was sitting in a cell, Szolnok County was being terrorized by a string of new brutal attacks against women. So what happened to János Kyriak after he was finally released is honestly heartbreaking. He moved back to Tiszafürdvár and actually went back to work at the very same shoe factory until he eventually went on a disability pension. According to his son, the man never started a new family and never received a single penny in compensation for those 11 years he spent rotting in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He lived out the rest of his days entirely alone until he passed away in the 80s. But we have to look at why he confessed in the first place. So beside the torturous interrogation, when Margit's body was found, the finger pointing at the factory started immediately. Everyone knew they'd been seeing each other and that they'd had their share of arguments, and Kyriak could feel the walls closing in. And when the investigators hauled him in and asked for his alibi, he panicked. He was a divorced man living alone, and he convinced himself that if he told the truth, that he was just at home by himself, they'd never believe him. So he told a white lie and claimed he'd been at his mother's house. But when the police went to the mother, she told them, "My son rarely comes to see me. I haven't seen him in 2 weeks." And just like that, Kyriak was caught in a lie. Under the pressure of the interrogation, he became more and more confused, eventually spiraling until he gave them that false confession just to make it stop. So a lot to uncover here, I think.
A lot. Let's just start with the fact that I think after all of those interrogations and all of the tactics, he kind of I think he believed that he would be sentenced anyway, that he would be acknowledged to be guilty no matter what he says. So maybe he was thinking if he cooperated, maybe it would be a bit better. Maybe it would play in his favor. What do you think?
I mean, it's hard to tell knowing that actually what happened. It's hard to form opinion, but I guess, yes, I think he really was in a state of panic because his girlfriend died. People knew they were having arguments, whatever the arguments were about, but it's a big factory, so people saw them, and he knew that if they asked their colleagues, everyone's going to say, oh yeah, they were having arguments. So yeah, he panicked, and then he didn't make it any better with saying a lie about where he was. But I don't think it would have made it better if he did tell the truth, to be honest, because they needed a scapegoat. As we just heard, that it was no such thing that a serial killer was active in Hungary in the perfect society. So I don't think this lie made it much worse than it would have been anyway.
That's what actually I was thinking about, that if he actually had told the truth, would it have been any different? Like, I don't think so. Like, this just maybe gave them more ammunition to go after him the way they already planned to do that, but I think they would have done it anyway. Regarding what you said about, serial killers not existing in a perfect society, like, first of all, that thing screwed people over in so many ways, like even then let's think about Chernobyl. But just not to go very far away, like at that point, it was the first victim, right?
Yeah, that was
Then
first victim.
But then it wasn't a serial killer. Then it was just a killing.
I think it's more about how they would find more people murdered later on, and they would still, you will see how they would do anything not to admit that there's a serial killer on the loose, basically.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's the violence, like how she was killed, that basically, triggered the panic in the government, in the institutions. And that's also the thing, I know that police has to start somewhere, and in most cases, it's like someone that but that was the problem here. It was just a random person, like he didn't really have any special relationship. I mean, Kovács, the actual killer, he just picked a victim that, looked like she could do. And this is like, again, in the wrong time, the wrong place. And in addition, basically Kovács, like he took the life of so many people, but the police also took the life, not like literally, of course, like they didn't kill anyone, at least so far. But yeah, they ruined the lives of people who already suffered, because like, again, your girlfriend just died. Like it could not have been easy on you, right? But they literally took years out of your life. This is horrible on so many levels.
And it's literally hang on a string that he was going to be executed. They could have hanged him for this.
True.
But the only reason they didn't hang him is because the Supreme Court found the whole narrative a little bit blurry.
I mean, it was extremely circumstantial. Like if we're not taking his confession into account, then the only thing that they have is that, like, okay, they had relationships and they argued a lot. That doesn't really add up to murder, right?
No. And also here, I think I mentioned that pulled out a pre-prepared axe. So where did they get that whole idea from, that he had a pre-prepared axe, and what happened to the axe if he did use it? So it's all ridiculous.
Exactly, especially since she was strangled and then she drowned. Like it doesn't make any sense. And it reminded me of the episode that we did last week on Pista, and that basically the only thing that they had on them is their confession. And I know that for this guy, Janusz didn't have much of a choice in a way, because like the confession was literally coerced out of him. But you need to keep your mouth shut, like sometimes you're literally your own worst enemy.
In this case, definitely, but I can imagine, as we just said, that he was panicking what was going to happen to him, and he was innocent. And I think when you're innocent, this panic probably gets a lot worse.
I mean, because you're not used to this kind of pressure. Like, when you're a killer, right? Like you are used to high stakes situations, and you kind of maybe know how to control your cool. But if you're just a regular guy who works at the shoe factory, you get me? Like, yeah, you are not equipped to deal with that for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel sorry for this guy a lot, especially that even though they found out that he was innocent, and at that point, after 11 years, his life was already ruined. It doesn't matter that they let him out of the prison. There was no coming back from this, I think.
Absolutely.
But now let's go back to the man who was actually responsible for all this, Péter Kovács. And this is a strange one, even for us, because after that first horrific murder, Kovács didn't strike again for a long time. There was this massive gap where he seemingly just sort of settled down. So I mentioned before that he was married, he was building a house, he had family. We don't know much about his family, but during these years, he did get married and put his energy into building the house for his family. And on the outside, he was playing the part of the devoted family man to a T. But as we see so often in these cases, starting a family was only a temporary distraction. The urges he'd felt in that cinema back in 57 had not gone away. They were just simmering under the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over again. So let's skip ahead to the evening of 13th of November 1963. So that was 6 years later. It took 6 years, but those urges finally pushed him back into the dark. He targeted a female worker who was heading toward the village of Homok, and his method had not changed. It was pure blunt force violence. He ambushed her and used a hammer to deliver a blow that left her completely defenseless. He tore her clothes off, clearly intending to repeat what he'd done before, but then something happened. For reasons that are still unclear, he wasn't able to finish what he'd started. He ended up leaving her there unconscious. Luckily, she was found shortly after, and thanks to some incredibly quick medical intervention, she actually survived the attack. But 6 months later, on the 31st of March 1964, Kovács was back at it again, in the same area. He'd clearly regained his confidence, or rather his desperation. He targeted another lone passerby coming up behind her with that same signature weapon, the hammer. He swung for her head, but in an incredible stroke of luck, she had this split-second reflex and ducked. Instead of a fatal blow to the skull, the hammer caught her in the neck. It was still a brutal hit, but it gave her just enough of an opening to scramble away and escape with her life. We had these two attacks, and this was happened when János Kiriak was already in prison, obviously 6 years later, and no one still suspected anything about this. Same as with Piroska. All of those things happened. All of those little girls went missing, and no one thought to look into this.
But I mean, with Piroshka, it was happening like with higher frequency than this. I think the whole case was in the span of 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, or something like that.
Happened within a year, I think.
Oh, so even faster, right? But here, this guy is really patient, and if he had those urges and they were so strong, I wonder what he did all the 6 years to calm himself down or to basically appease his desires. I think he had to do something, and those things just don't go away.
I think maybe he had some sort of remorse, or rather fear of being caught, and he decided, okay, I've done this, but I'm going to try to forget about it and have a normal life, even though I have these urges. Maybe he even admitted that these urges are sick, and he tried to sort of bury them deep, but obviously not deep enough, and they did come to the surface later on.
In my head, I'm thinking maybe he came to revisit the place where it happened, to give him some kind of flash of what he's done. And at some point, maybe it wore off and he had to do this again.
Maybe. It's hard to tell because there are no psychiatric evaluations about him, or at least they are not available for the public. I would love to read them, to be honest, but unfortunately, I couldn't find anything like that.
I do think he was scared, though. I'm with you on that. I think maybe he thought that 6 years is enough time for everyone not to connect the cases together.
Yeah.
But these two, second and third victim were really, really lucky, honestly.
Yes, extremely lucky. Thank God that, especially the second one, that ducked and basically that saved her life.
Mm-hmm.
So, good job on that one.
But I think, what else makes me think that he was scared? Because after unsuccessful events with the second victim, he waited for a year to strike again.
He waited 6 months.
6 months. Okay. Still quite a lot of time, I would say. I really think he was waiting for the incident to be forgotten, for no one not to connect him to the place.
I'm really not sure. He was also, we have to look at the fact that he had a family as well, and he was also a truck driver. So that means he was on the road a lot. So maybe he was busy, maybe he had to spend time with his family in his free time, so he couldn't find time for his, so to speak, hobbies.
But that's the thing, as far as we know, at least up till now, he had a perfect cover with being a truck driver, right? So he could have killed women in different places, but for some reason he really had a liking for that particular place.
I think that particular place was because this shoe factory was one of the biggest Hungarian factories back in the 60s. They were making these trainers that were super popular, and that was our closest thing to, sports trainers in the middle of communism. We didn't have Adidas, we It doesn't matter. And I think this factory provided a job to a lot of people from that area. And he knew that when their shift was over, all these women who worked there, they would eventually turn from the main road heading to one of the farms where there was nothing, no infrastructure, there was no lights, there were no cars, there were no people. So it's basically given him the perfect hunting ground, the shoe factory.
So basically, it's like one of those Criminal Mind kind of things where a serial killer strikes where he feels confident, where he knows the surrounding.
He knew the surrounding, and also he knew that eventually all of these women would be alone in a place
it makes sense.
That's dark and nobody sees.
I understand. But what happened after?
So after that, bodies started to appear. On the 4th of May, 1964, so just so that you're still following the chronological order, it was 2 months later, a woman was pulled from the Tisza River near Nagyrév. Here we go, Nagyrév again.
Oh my God, Nagyrév again.
She was in a terrible state. Investigators estimated she'd been in that water for about a month. Because of the condition of the remains, they couldn't find any obvious signs of foul play, so the official cause of death was simply recorded as drowning. Then, in April 1965, it happened again. So that was a year later. This time, it was the heavily decomposed body of a teenage girl found in the Tisza. Once more, the investigators looked at the remains and, seeing no clear evidence of a struggle or external trauma, they made a massive assumption. They concluded that the girl had likely taken her own life. So again, there is a pattern. There is two women and they still don't connect the dots, either on purpose or they are really this clueless.
I think it's on purpose, because I'm pretty sure it's different detectives or like police officers at different time. Like, I think there should have been more than one, police officer responsible for these kind of things. So I think it's just a pattern, right? Like you have the directive from the government that like this is how the things should be. But if the girl was extremely decomposed, then it means that he killed her way prior to when she was found.
Definitely, yes.
So it means that he was actually speeding up and he was reducing the gap between his killings.
Probably. I mean, it's hard to tell when these two women were murdered, but yeah, he was definitely getting more and more impatient, probably, with these urges.
I think especially since, like, again, he was seeing that he was getting away with it. I think that was adding confidence, to what he was doing.
Definitely. Finally, at this point, well, not too long after, the police started to connect the dots, suspecting that a serial killer might actually be on the loose in the area. They'd spotted several similarities across the cases, which triggered a much more thorough investigation in April and May of 1965. So I'm not quite sure what happened here. I tried to figure this out by reading different articles because in April 65, they find this girl. They conclude that she probably jumped off the bridge or something. And then in the same month, they actually think there is a serial killer. So I'm not 100% sure what happened there because there was no other body at that point that would say, yeah, it's a serial killer. The authorities cast a wide net, bringing in about 40 men as potential suspects, and Péter Kovács was actually one of them. He was right there in their sights, but because he had the stable family life and the solid work history, they just could not see him as a monster. He was officially crossed off the list, and the investigation hit a dead end, leaving him free to continue. So this is eerily similar to Andrei Chikatilo, the Russian serial killer. He was taken in multiple times into questioning, but because he was part of the Communist Party, he was released every single time and he was continuing murdering these girls and boys in the area. I think he killed like 49 people or something. I'm not quite sure what the exact number is. But yeah, this whole thing that serial killers is a Western disease, I think it slowed down many investigations in the socialist East, so to speak, not just Hungary.
I mean, yeah, I guess it makes sense. I'm just thinking about Kovács himself. I'm thinking, was he actually worried when he was in the interrogation room? Like, was he thinking, oh my God, this is it? They're onto me? Or he was just looking at this like, oh, it's just a routine procedure. They're like asking 40 other men and there is nothing pointing out to me. So it's just a thing that I have to go through.
That's the thing. I think you asked a really good question here because this happened in 1965, of the spring of 1965. And probably that's when he was interrogated or questioned. I don't think he was actually interrogated. But then 2 years passed until something else happened, which we will discuss in a minute. So it might have stopped him or slowed him down a little bit because, as you said earlier, all of these incidents were getting more frequent and then suddenly nothing happens for 2 years.
Yeah, I think maybe he thought that it was better to exercise the caution because at least before they were basically writing everything off as an accident or ending their own life. But right now they actually acknowledge the existence of serial killers. So that was kind of bad for him. So it makes sense why he would try to basically hold off until like this notion would wear off.
I honestly don't think that when they brought these 40 men in, they would actually release to the press that it was a serial killer. I think they were really cautious using those words because of socialism. But who knows? But it definitely slowed him down. It didn't stop him, but it did slow him down. By the 20th of June, 1967, the situation took another dark turn. So 1967, more than 2 years, because it's June. So took another dark turn when another female body was found, this time in the Körös River near Öcsöd. This wasn't like the previous discoveries. The violence here was unmistakable. The woman had been beaten so severely before she died that her skull was actually cracked and her body had been mutilated. The police found blood and tissue remains on the railing of the nearby Körös Bridge, which led them to assume she'd been thrown straight over the side into the river. This brutality forced the investigators to wake up. They started re-examining the potential links between all these young women found in the local rivers and the new Öcsöd murder. Because of that specific skull injury, they finally began to wonder if the Öcsöd killer was the same person who'd been ambushing women with blows to the head on their way home. But this time, the victim had left them something behind, a valuable clue. Investigators found a tiny piece of glass lodged under one of her fingernails.
While you were talking about this, I'm thinking the extra brutality in this case, I think it just because he had to wait this long, it was building up in him. And at some point he could not control himself. So he had to basically overcompensate, I would say, for all the restrictions he had to put in himself.
Probably. I mean, he did have to wait 2 years, and that was after he was already really speeding up with these crimes. So yeah, probably that's what happened. So with those glasses, Péter Kovács was back in the crosshairs, and this time the police had a timeline. They discovered that just 1 day before that body was found, Kovács had taken his work truck out for his own use. He'd been doing what they called a black hole, which means basically an off-the-books job with his brother-in-law, which put him exactly where he needed to be to commit the murder. Now, his wife tried to step in and provide an alibi for him, claiming he was elsewhere, but the investigators weren't buying it. They didn't trust her story for a second, and instead of crossing him off the list, as they did back in 65, they decided to keep digging. When the investigators finally got a look inside a company truck, they hit the jackpot. They found shards of glass scattered right there in the driver's cabin. As it turns out, on June 19, Kovács had accidentally clipped the chain blocking the entrance to the shoe factory, shattering the truck's windshield. They even found tiny fragments of that same glass clinging to his clothes. The police were also having a result with their witnesses. They managed to track down several people who placed Kovács, his brother-in-law, and the woman who would later become the victim all together in a pub. And the net was finally undeniably closing in. The breakthrough finally came after the police sat down with his brother-in-law. He cracked and admitted that the three of them had been out having a few drinks, but said he eventually left Kovács alone with the women under the impression that Kovács was going to drive her home. On the 11th of August 1967, Péter Kovács was officially arrested. He tried to deny everything at first, but after just 2 days in custody, he folded and confessed to the Öcsöd murder. By the end of that month, the floodgates had opened and he admitted to the murders of the woman pulled from the Tisza as well. And I would just like to add that the small piece of glass wasn't just a lucky find. It was found because the victim had fought back so fiercely. Her struggle in the truck is what likely caused the window to break, or for her to scrape the glass into her hand under her nail. And it honors her memory to note that her resistance is ultimately what brought him down. So if she wasn't struggling in the car, this guy probably wouldn't have been caught, and Kyriak János would have stayed in prison for the rest of his life.
Damn, I'm just thinking, a few moments ago we were talking about the fact that he was extra brutal with her. I'm thinking, okay, maybe besides the fact that he had to wait this long, maybe it's because she fought back. You know, maybe that kind of enraged him. What do you think?
Well, it's not just that enraged him, but by the sound of it, she did fight back, and that caused the truck to crash. And this is how the window broke. So it crashed into a chain. So there must have been the reason for that. Maybe this woman even got out of the car somehow, but he caught her at the end.
Damn. And also, oh my God, like Kovács' wife did much better than János's mother. Like the woman, his mother couldn't even pretend that maybe he was around. You get me? She just gave him out completely. But Kovács' wife really, really tried to cover up for him. Like, why? I'm trying to know why János' mother did not even try to help him out.
I guess that's a question we will not know. Probably, I mean, I'm guessing here, but maybe the police investigated this before they would actually start to make these allegations against him. So maybe they went, asked János where you were. I was at my mother's. And then they went to the mother and then she said that. And that's when they started to interrogate him even harder than before. I don't know. I don't have the answer there. Sorry.
Do you think Kovács' wife, she thought that maybe he was the one, or she was convinced that he was innocent and she was just trying to protect him?
No,
I mean, we cannot know, but just what you think.
I have no idea what happened there, and I'm not even sure why the police would question that what she was saying as a lie. That would have been really interesting to find out more about, but I couldn't find anything, fortunately. Maybe she wouldn't believe that her husband would do such thing, probably. I mean, if you think that your family life is perfect or you're happily living in a marriage, and then suddenly these allegations come up and someone tells you that your husband is a serial killer, I think your mind just can't go there at first. You sort of want to get back to your life, even though it's starting to fall apart slowly.
I mean, if someone told me that you're a serial killer, I would not believe them because, like, you don't strike me as a type, and I think that I know you.
Why are you telling me that? I'm a serial killer.
No, I know you're not a serial killer. I'm just trying to explain that, like, you get me? Like, when one person is something to you, it's very hard to see them as anyone else. Like, if someone even came to me with, like, hard evidence that, like, okay, possibly Reika or someone else I know, you get me, was doing something shady, it would be hard for me to believe those hardcore evidence, over what I know about you. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Because in my head, it doesn't compute, it doesn't make sense.
Well, yeah, and then imagine that is your husband.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure why me is the example.
Because like we're talking here, yeah, but
anyway, let's just take a moment to honor this woman who was obviously a victim, and I feel extremely sorry for her.
But she was really brave.
But it was very brave of her that she fought back and, in a sense, helped to bring this guy down. But here is the real kicker. By February 1968, the prosecution was forced to face a devastating reality. They realized Péter Kovács was the one who had murdered that girl, Margit Szegedy, leaving the Martfű shoe factory years earlier, meaning they had the wrong man. János Kiriak was innocent. Investigators also suspected Kovács was responsible for yet another murder, but they could never quite find the evidence to prove it. So, after 11 years of serving a sentence for a crime he didn't commit, János Kiriak was finally released, and meanwhile the man actually responsible, Péter Kovács, was facing the music. After confessing to 4 murders and those 2 failed attacks, the Szolnok County Court handed down a death sentence, which the Supreme Court upheld. Kovács tried for a last-minute plea for clemency, but the Presidential Council wasn't having any of it. They rejected his request, and on the 1st of December 1968, the man known as the Martfű Monster was executed. But even with him gone, the shadow of his crimes remains. It's widely believed that Kovács had more victims than the ones we know about, whose bodies have simply never been found. So, yeah, that's the story of Péter Kovács.
I would say, this is definitely an interesting case. Like, it's hard to say that it ended with a happy end because it definitely didn't. So many lives were lost. And this poor János guy who not only lost his girlfriend, but also 11 years of his life. And I don't think his life after that was all sunshine and rainbow. Like, I think it was pretty devastating even after that. But at least they caught him, because when I'm thinking about Bela Kish that was never caught, that sends, chills down my spine. So at least they caught him.
Yeah, they did catch him, but I think they could have caught him much earlier if they wouldn't, the whole system would have worked properly, then they could have caught him way earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a pretty common thing in Soviet Union, sometimes even right now, to be honest. I don't think that the times have changed that much, that it could never happen in present days, but then absolutely.
It's just these little things that they overlooked. I mean, he would follow this girl on the first night. He would have an iron object because he didn't have the hammer at that time, obviously, just coming out of the cinema that gave him the, so to speak, inspiration. And then they said that János Kiriak had an axe, which is so contradicting. An axe and an iron object is not the same thing.
Absolutely.
So I don't think, it just proves that, okay, they caught a guy, they caught a scapegoat, and they've done anything to send him to prison or even to execute him, which, thank God, the Supreme Court didn't allow. But still, as you said, or as we discussed earlier, his life was pretty much ruined at that point.
I don't think he could possibly ever reintegrate into society, and I'm pretty sure lots of people maybe would feel awkward around him. Maybe some people would still think that maybe he did it.
He went back to the same shoe factory where he worked, where people were pointing fingers at him, that the people who technically sent him, to prison. And then you have to work with those people for the rest of your life or until you retired. Yeah, I don't think he had a happy redemption after he got out of prison.
And 11 years in prison, I don't think that does any good to your mental health as well, So I think he must have returned from there a broken man for sure.
Definitely. And he's never started a family after that. So he was divorced at that point when he went to prison, or when he was the boyfriend of this girl. So he had a son from the first marriage, but then he never started a family, even though he could have been still young, because I would assume he was in his 20s, late 20s. So he would still be under his 40s when he got out.
I mean, the dude was just scared to have a girlfriend, again, because who knows what could happen? He might end up in prison again. But anyway, it's just me joking.
I don't think that was the reason. He just couldn't. I mean, as you said, he was a broken man, completely broken by society, 100%.
It's true.
And who knows what they did to him in the prison as well.
Mm-hmm. True.
I don't know much about the prison system in Hungary, but this prison, the Szeged-Csillag prison, is like one of the hardcore ones.
I mean, it was USSR. It couldn't have been pretty.
It still is. So that's where the murderers go, apparently. So it's really sad, as you said, that it took them such a long time and so many lives were ruined in that 10 years.
It's true.
So weird, right? How a single shard of glass and a decade-old breach of trust can change the course of history. We hope you guys enjoyed the dark side of Martfű with us today. If this case gave you chills, or if you're just glad you weren't walking home from a Hungarian shoe factory in the 60s, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't lose us in the algorithm. This was Reika and Roderick on Start with the Weird, and we'll see you in the next one.
See ya.
Bye, guys.